has an embarrassing story from when they were my age, a memory from youth that haunts them into adulthood. Maybe you were pantsed in front of your class or spilled a drink on your crush. I too have one of those moments, a defining, embarrassing moment that I will carry with me through life. But you see, the most embarrassing moment of my life is happening right now, as I stand in front of a panel of strangers and publicly beg for my right to exist. Nothing is more humiliating and dehumanizing than pleading for one's own existence. How did we get here?
Hi, I'm Andrew Chang. Welcome to About That. That was Lola Smith, 12 years old, non-binary, speaking to a panel of doctors in Florida who were deciding whether or not the state's Board of Medicine would allow children and youth like Lola to access gender-affirming care.
Critics from groups like Equality Florida spoke out beforehand, arguing the prohibitions will harm trans kids.
Transgender people are human beings, and we should be seen as human beings and treated as such.
So when we talk about gender-affirming care, what are we talking about? We're talking about social, medical, psychological supports to help someone who is transgender live according to their gender identity. That can include things like puberty blockers, which do what you'd think. They hit pause on puberty, giving kids and their families more time to make choices in their medical care. It can also include trans youth taking hormones like testosterone or estrogen, depending on their gender. Groups like the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics say that gender-affirming care is safe and effective, and that foregoing gender-affirming care can have severe health consequences, both mental and physical. But Florida banned it for anyone under 18, and it's not the only state.
The Idaho House forwarded a bill today that would ban healthcare providers from providing gender-affirming medical care to minors with gender dysphoria.
GOP lawmakers in Kentucky passed legislation to ban gender-affirming care for transgender minors.
Governor Brian Kemp signed off on a bill to ban most gender-affirming care for transgender kids.
And even outside of legislation, transgender people just seem increasingly targeted on multiple fronts right around the world. In the UK, the government has vetoed Scottish gender reforms.
The British government says it'll block a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament making it easier for people to change their legal gender.
There are people protesting drag shows on the streets of New York City. In Australia, Nazi flags and salutes are on display at rallies against transgender rights.
Liberal MP Moira Deeming was at the Let Women Speak anti-trans rights rally when more than 24 neo-Nazis joined the protest, performing the Hitler salute on the steps of Victoria's Parliament.
And then statements like this made at an annual political conference for conservatives in the United States, featuring speakers from around the world.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
So today, our look at the tidal wave of legislation actively targeting transgender people washing over the United States, and how some states are making it their mission to fight back and offer protection. So first, let's understand what these refuge states are offering refuge from. So in South Dakota, a new law bans puberty blockers and hormone therapy in minors, and any minor already receiving such treatment has to be tapered off of that treatment by the end of this year. A proposed bill in Oklahoma would ban those treatments for anyone under 26, so well into adulthood. In Arkansas, there's a bill on the table that would leave trans people open to criminal prosecution, sexual indecency with a child, if they enter a public washroom matching their gender and a child is present. In Texas, dozens of bills have been introduced, including one that would prohibit teachers from assisting with social transition. So, something like using a trans child's preferred pronouns or chosen name. Florida has also seen several bills on the table. One would effectively allow one parent to take their child away from the other across state lines if they're receiving or at risk of receiving gender-affirming care. Critics say that amounts to interstate kidnapping. Now, this kind of legislation is not new. For years, politicians have proposed these kinds of bills and bans, but the people who track this stuff say it's also the sheer volume of legislation that we should all be paying attention to. So according to the American Civil Liberties Union, there were 20 anti-trans bills filed in 2019. In 2020, that rose to 51. In 2021, 110. Last year, there were 162. So the numbers have been increasing, but this year there's been an explosion. By one count, there have been around 500 bills introduced. Some have already passed, others are still awaiting approval.
Beyond what the bills themselves do, even hearing these bills and watching the hearings and hearing the hurtful language that comes out has a negative impact on people's mental health. I believe the Trevor Project had a poll recently that showed that 86% of transgender youth report a worsened mental health state because of anti-trans legislation that's being pushed out right now.
That is Erin Reed. She's an activist who's been tracking this legislation in the United States for the past 3 years. She joined us to walk us through a map that she's created to help track it all. I know, Erin, that you've put in a lot of work to track and catalog all of this legislation that has come tumbling through state legislatures across the U.S. And I'm looking at the map right now. And first of all, can I ask you, why did you do this? I mean, what need did you see that was out there that was touching you so personally?
So as I continue to track all of these laws, the most common question that I get, and I was getting this 4 or 5, 10 times a day in my inbox, was, I live in X state. Do I have to leave? Do I have to flee my state right now? Is it too dangerous for me to stay? And the converse of that was, I live in X state and I am leaving. I'm in college. I want to apply to colleges. I have a trans kid. What state is going to be safe for me to go to? And so I sought out to take all of the hearings that I've watched, take all of the election results, look at all of the history of the trans bills in these states, and assess the risk as somebody that has probably watched more hours of hearings than almost anybody else on these topics. I've got a good grasp of which states are the ones that are likely to move forward with these bills. And I've mapped them out and I've tracked them. And the reason why I made this map is so that this person who is sitting in a state like Tennessee, where there are really harmful laws that are being passed, they need to make an economic calculation. Like, am I going to go to Illinois, which might be further away, but which has extremely protective laws? Or maybe I can hop across the border to North Carolina, which, while dangerous still, is not Tennessee. And so I made this map essentially to help these families understand, and then also to help the general public understand the scope of these laws. Because whenever you view it in map form, you can see how pervasive in some areas of the country these laws are.
So walk me through what I am seeing here. So clearly I can see it's color-coded, and the dark red states are those which you've sort of deemed to be the worst in terms of legislation targeting transgender people. So what qualifies a state in your mind to meet that bar?
There are a few rubrics that I use for the states that are in the worst tier of states. These are the states that essentially make it very hard to live as a transgender person in those states. If your state is in deep red, what that means is that you have medical bans that are already passed that will forcibly detransition trans youth. You have bills that prevent people from learning about transgender people or gay people in schools. You have bills that ban people from bathrooms, that ban transgender teachers from being able to use their pronouns in schools. It's a collection of several of these types of laws that if they are passed, if multiple of them are passed, then they go instantly into this risk category. A really good example of a law that would place somebody, or a really good example of policy that would place a state in this category is Texas. The governor of Texas last year started investigating the parents of transgender youth for child abuse and essentially attempting to potentially take kids away from trans parents. Looking at this year and the number of bills that are moving this year, Texas more than deserved that particular ranking.
So these dark red states, we're essentially talking about states whose legislation, as a matter of identity, threaten a person's very existence.
Exactly. And these are the states that I get the most questions from.
What about the orange states, high risk?
These are states that I have watched legislation move through these states. I have watched them pass one of the chambers, so either the House or the Senate, and I've watched previous years similar legislation see near success. This year, anti-trans bills are seeing higher success in red states than they were in previous years. And so knowing, for instance, whenever I'm categorizing something, I see in Montana in 2021, their gender-affirming care ban failed by 2 votes. Looking at what happened in South Dakota, Utah, Iowa, and all of these other states this year, I know that those 2 votes are likely going to be potentially swung, and Montana is going to be at higher risk this year. And so I use that sort of a metric to look at all these states and to say, what is the likelihood that these states might pass one of these extremely harmful pieces of legislation that target a transgender person's very existence? Most of these states, for instance, already have sports bans on the books, which are not in and of themselves justifying a dark red risk, according to my map, but which are a good indicator that further legislation is on the way.
The good news here for the trans community is that there are some states that you've sort of earmarked as being either low risk or quite safe for trans people. Walk me through those.
Yes, absolutely. So you will note a number of states here that are in light blue or dark blue. The light blue states are states that have experienced very little to no push on anti-trans bills. Places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, we have not seen any success for anti-trans legislation in these states. No gender-affirming care bans, etc. Some states, like Arizona, we have seen some of these bills pushed, but they have a Democratic governor that has already expressed that she will veto the bills if they get to her desk. So for people that are looking at, like, where should I go? Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, they might be good places to go to. They might be safe for a little while. And then your dark blue states are states that not only are they not pushing this legislation, they have passed bills that protect the community in very strong ways. A state like Minnesota. Minnesota, the governor of Minnesota, Tim Wells, he recently pushed an executive order that said, if you make it to my borders in Minnesota, we're going to ignore subpoenas to bring you back to your home state for these criminal bans. We're going to ignore, we're going to basically say that if a state tries to pull your kid away for child custody disputes, just because you're getting them gender-affirming care, we're not going to allow that in this state.
Why is it that you think that that has arisen as a sort of fact of life, these refuge states taking shape right across the country?
I think that legislators are seeing that people are leaving these states. Even in my own hometown, I am looking here where I live in Maryland at my local parents' Facebook group. And I'm starting to see people saying, I just moved from Texas. I've got a trans kid. Is this place going to be safe? Are the school systems safe here? I know that people are moving to Minnesota. People are moving to Colorado. I know several families that moved from Texas to Colorado and to California. And I think that now these states that are out there, they realize that they have a responsibility to take care of these people that are fleeing to their states. And so I think that's why we're seeing legislation that protects them.
You know this better than anyone. What keeps you up at night when you look at a map like this?
All of the kids, all of the trans youth, the trans teens that live in these states that are in dark red. We talked just now about people that can flee. Most people will not be able to. It costs a lot of money to uproot your family, to get a new job across the country. And there are hundreds of thousands of transgender youth in these states that are deep red that are going to see their medication pulled. And, you know, unfortunately, as an activist in this space, I'm the one that gets sent the notes sometimes. I'm the one that gets sent the suicide notes. I'm the one that hears from the parents. I get told so often now, there's a kid that we lost in our support group. And it hurts me because I know what the stakes are. I was a trans kid growing up, and I know how much it hurts to be forced to get that pulled away from you and to not be able to show that to the rest of the world and not being able to be yourself. And I just that does keep me up at night. And and that's also why the people fighting in places like Nebraska give me hope and give the community hope.
Erin, wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me on.
So with all of the legislation in the United States that targets trans people, look, it can feel like a pretty dark moment for the community. But as we close out the show, I wanted to leave you with this moment, a thought from Erin Reed, the activist that we spoke to earlier in the program, about why she feels that trans people shouldn't give up hope. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
I was alive during the 2000 to 2005 gay marriage fight. And we saw in 2003 to 2005, 32 states enact constitutional bans against gay marriage. And it felt dark then. It felt kind of like it does right now back then. I know, though, that gay people kept coming out. Gay people kept existing. And these laws are not going to stop trans people from existing. And change is going to continue to happen. Every day that we are in public, we move the needle. And I think that in these states, the needle does continue to get moved.